In the next chapter, having looked at risk in some detail, we start looking at controls. In other words, how you can reduce risk. Or to use another definition of control, how can you make sure that what should be happening is happening? How do you know? Well, the way you know is by having controls. And it is extremely likely in the exam that at some stage you will be asked to evaluate, analyze, or recommend controls. So you need to understand this really well. Now, a very, very useful framework for thinking about controls, which we'll look at in a bit of detail, is to go back to systems theory and think about controls over inputs to a process, controls over the process itself, and controls over output. And we'll look in detail very, very shortly at what those mean. Now, it's also important if you're understanding controls, and this again goes back to some of your studies in E1, to think about single and double loop control. Again, we'll remind you of what that was all about. You can also have controls that are to do with feedback, they're to do with what's happened in the past, or they may be feed forward, they may be to do with what's going to happen in the future. And finally in this chapter, if you are recommending or evaluating controls, you need to make sure it's appropriate for the organisation. And there's a mnemonic secret that allows you to analyse different characteristics of an organisation and therefore decide what sort of controls are appropriate. The official definition of a control is ensuring that activities planned and undertaken lead to desired outcomes, or as we said before, making sure that what should be happening is happening. And we've already mentioned the idea of input, process and output controls. What this is saying is that there are three fundamental approaches to controlling anything. The first way of controlling something is to think about the inputs to the process, what's going into the process. And for most processes, at least one of the main inputs are people. Who is doing this particular process? Who is carrying it out? So that means that you can exert control by making sure that the right people are doing the job. For example, you might have a really good recruitment process so that you recruit only the best and most appropriate people for each job. And maybe you have good training in place to ensure that they really know what they're doing and are expert. Perhaps you have a good pay and motivation and reward structure to make sure that people are motivated to do the right things. Those are all controls over input. The second way you can control anything is to focus on the process. You're not now focusing on who is doing it, you're focusing on how they are doing it. In other words, you're putting in place a procedure. And the assumption here is that if everyone follows the procedure, if everyone follows the policy, if everyone does things the way it is meant to be done, then you will reduce risk. That is a form of control. And the third type of control focuses on output, focuses on what's actually coming out of the process. And what this means is that you're putting in place some sort of measurement. So you have a measure to indicate how effective the process is. If your measure goes above or below a certain amount, it shows that there is a problem and this needs investigation. Let's illustrate this with a brief example. Let's illustrate this by thinking about health and safety risk, a key risk faced by many, many organisations. Thinking at a fairly high level here, how could you control health and safety? Well, one way you could control that is by perhaps appointing a health and safety officer to deal with these issues, or perhaps having health and safety training for all your staff so that everyone knows what they should be doing. You can put in place some health and safety procedures, and this is very, very common. Organisations have procedures about who is allowed to move things, about leaving trailing wires on the floor, about electrical equipment, all sorts of things. And the final way you could think about controlling health and safety is by having measures. You could think about, for example, measuring days lost to accidents, or perhaps the number of accidents, or the number of near misses, or something like that. Various ways to evaluate how effectively you are managing health and safety. Let's take that framework now and apply it to a number of controls. See if we can think about whether they are input, process, or output. So take a few minutes to see if you can do that for this list of controls. Okay, so this is a list of fairly common controls, and just in order to illustrate the point about input, process, and output, we'll see if we can classify them into those three categories. Actual versus budget report is an output control. You're monitoring financial data against the budget to see what the outcomes are. But it's a very valuable control, because if your performance is below budget, it is something that needs further investigation and follow-up. The corporate governance codes that we looked at previously are a process control. They set down certain procedures and certain principles. The assumption is that if everyone follows those procedures and those principles in terms of their governance, you will reduce risk. Recruitment, we've already touched on, as being a key input control. If you are recruiting the right people to the organisation, you are reducing risk very significantly. Earnings per share is an output control, measures what the overall performance financially of the organisation is, whether things are going well or not at the very highest level. Something like sign-off limits are a process control, ensures that if the right person is signing off payments, therefore you will reduce risk. Having a written code of ethics is also a process control. Again, the assumption is that if everyone adheres to a set of rules and principles, you will reduce risk. Mystery shoppers are people who pose as shoppers or consumers of an organisation's service in order to check how good it is. You can see that as an output control. They're actually testing the output of the organisation, but it can also be used as a process control to see that people are following the right procedure. Health and safety awareness training we've already mentioned as being an input control. Having credit control procedures, for example, chasing payments after they're overdue for a certain period, sending letters, perhaps starting legal proceedings if there's a significant delay in payment. These are process controls. It's a set of rules that you can follow. Staff appraisals are an output control. You're seeing how well people have performed during the time period. And the balanced scorecard is a good example of an output control. Provides a range of measures you can use to indicate whether things are going well in the organisation or not. Now, before we get into the detail, it's worth recapping how a control works. We have a system, if you remember, from your previous studies, which comprises an input, a process, and an output. The output for that system can be measured by a sensor. The sensor might then use a comparator to compare the output to a standard, and then depending on whether the output meets the standard or not, it may be that something will change in terms of the system, and that's known as an effector. So to take a very simple example, if we think about a kettle where the process is the water being boiled, the output of that process is the temperature of the water, and the thermostat is a sensor that measures the temperature and compares it using a comparator to a standard, and the standard in this case is boiling point. So long as the temperature remains below boiling point, then the effector will continue to apply the input, and the kettle will keep on heating up. Once the temperature hits boiling point, then the sensor can now tell the output has hit the standard, has hit boiling point, and the effector will cause this current to switch off and the water to stop heating. So that's a very simple example of a control. The thermostat and the on-off switch controls the temperature of the water. Now if we take a slightly more complex example, it is possible for the standard itself to be changed. Now clearly this isn't possible with a kettle. The standard is always going to be boiling point. But if we think about the example perhaps of a budget, you can see how this might work. The output for the organisation, perhaps its profitability, is determined by the accounting function, that's the censor, and then is compared to the standard, which perhaps is the budget. And maybe the performance is coming in below budget, but then perhaps the budget was put together in better economic times, so the budget itself might be unrealistic. The high-level controller at this point, let's say the finance director, might take a decision that actually the budget just isn't realistic anymore and needs to be revised downwards. The standard can then be revised downwards. That is going to have an impact on the comparator and on the effector and what feeds in to the input in the organisation. So this is known as double loop or secondary feedback. You have one comparison loop between the output and the standard, but you have another comparison loop between the standard and what the high-level controller thinks the standard should be. Just note that in an organisational context, the budget is probably the most common standard to use, the estimate of future performance, but sometimes you can use previous time periods, particularly last year, and you may use similar organisations as a standard. This is known as benchmarking, comparing yourselves to other organisations that you consider to be comparable. At this stage, we also need to recap the key terms feedback and feed forward from your previous studies. Feedback is information about the results that will help with control. And there is a distinction, you may recall, between negative feedback, which says that something is deviating from the plan, it is performing below standard, and positive feedback, which means that our performance is above the standard. What this may mean, perhaps, is that we'll raise the standard in order to keep on improving our performance. Feed forward, on the other hand, looks at the anticipated results and compares them to plan. Let's say, for example, you have performance against budget, let's say your profit, and it's forecasting a nice healthy increase. However, your budget, let's say, calls for a bigger increase. Now, if you're looking at this now, you would say this is all absolutely fine. We're running ahead of budget. However, if you're looking into the future, where you think your profit is going is below budget. That means you have a feed forward problem, and you really need to take some action now to try and increase your profit to ensure that you stay ahead of budget. Notice that one of the differences between these two ideas is that feed forward can actually prevent problems. Feedback, because it looks backwards, it's a historical measure, it can't prevent problems. It can only correct problems that have already happened. It's important to recognize that all controls have limitations. But rather than look at this theoretically, let's take a concrete example. Let's talk about budgets, since we've already mentioned they are a very key control in most organizations. However, we can use this to illustrate, perhaps, why controls might not always work well. Can you think of any reasons why the use of budgets might not be an effective way of controlling an organization? Take a few minutes to think about it and write down your thoughts, then we'll debrief. Okay, well, there are lots of reasons why budgets might not be effective, so here are just a few examples. Firstly, as we've already mentioned, the budget itself may perhaps be inappropriate. Perhaps, as we previously mentioned, it was put together during better, or indeed worse, economic times, and it's no longer a realistic estimate of future performance. It no longer makes sense to compare the organisation's performance against it. It needs to be revised. Perhaps it is too difficult to measure your financial performance accurately. Or at least to the accuracy required by the budget. Maybe financial performance depends on quite complex judgments or accounting issues, and therefore it is hard to compare it against the budget. Perhaps financial performance takes too long to measure. by the time you get the financial results, the feedback isn't really very useful as a way of making changes. Perhaps you can't identify the reasons for variances. If you're deviating from the plan, but you don't really know why, then you can't take action on the basis of your budget report. And that means it's not a useful control tool. Or perhaps there's a motivation issue. Perhaps staff don't care about achieving the budget or not. In that case, it doesn't matter what the budget says, it's not going to have an impact on the organisation. You're not going to get effective control in operation. Okay, so we've looked in a bit of detail at control systems. Now, as previously mentioned, you may need in the exam to recommend appropriate controls for an organisation. In this case, you've got to be very, very careful to analyse certain characteristics of the organisation so that you can be sure that what you're recommending is appropriate. The sorts of things to look out for in the scenario can be summarised under the secret mnemonic. And I'll run quickly through these. There's a lot of overlap here with your previous studies. One of the factors you're going to have to think about is the structure of the organisation. For example, is it a flat structure or is it a very tall structure? A tall structure is going to lend itself more readily to supervision as a form of control, whereas this is going to be impossible in a flat structure. You may have to think about the environmental conditions. Is the organisation in a very competitive situation? Is it very fast moving? If so, then they might not want to implement controls that are too rigid and that will constrain their ability to react to changes in the environment. You'll have to think about culture. Remember, culture, the way we do things around here. Is it the sort of culture where people follow rules? Or is it the sort of culture where they don't? That's going to have a bearing on whether, for example, procedural controls are likely to work. You can think about the role of the centre in decision making. Is it very centralised? If it's very centralised, then the centre may find it quite easy to put in place strict controls. If it's very decentralised, that's going to be harder. The established strategy being pursued. Think about your Porter strategies here. Is it a differentiator? Or is it a cost leader? This will affect the focus of the controls. A differentiator will have controls over quality, whereas a cost leader will have controls over price. Think perhaps about the different controls that are going to be in place for Waitrose, for example, who want to make sure that all their produce they sell is of a very high standard, with someone like Asda, who are going to try and make sure that they're not spending any money unnecessarily. And controls are also going to depend on the level of technology being used. If you are in a high technology environment, then that's where your controls need to focus. And later on in the course, we'll look specifically about the sort of controls you apply to an IT systems. Now, the next lecture example practices a skill that you will be called upon to do many times in your studies and almost certainly in the exam. It's taking a set of given risks and then suggesting some suitable controls in order to mitigate those risks. Now, to do this, we're going to refer back to Chapter 1, Example 1, where we did the exercise generating risks for British Airways. So just to remind you what the risks we identified were, firstly, we had the risk of demand falls due to recession. So what controls could be put in place to try and mitigate that? We've got rise in oil prices. Can we do anything there? Got the risk of industrial action. Staff going on strike and disrupting operations. Got a risk of bad weather, causing disruption to flights. Got the risk of reducing demand, and in particular touched on climate change concerns. So concern about the environment means that people fly less. And then we've got risks relating to safety of either passengers or staff. So for each of those risks, have a think about what controls we could put in place, and in particular, see if you can generate some extra ideas using the framework of input controls, controls over people or other inputs to a process controls, whether there are procedures you could put in place, or output controls, are there measures that would help here? So press pause, have a go at generating as many controls as you can, and then press play when you're ready for the debrief. So what controls could we adopt over the risk that the recession causes a fall in demand for our services? And remember, British Airways, as a relatively high-cost, high-end provider, is particularly vulnerable to this. Well, to be honest, it's quite tricky to think of input controls that might help. But one that might relate to people is perhaps to do with their recruitment policy, that if they make sure they have good staff, it's going to give them a competitive advantage. And then even if recession does cause a reduction in demand for the industry as a whole, perhaps BA will be less affected than some other airlines. What about any process controls? Are there any procedures that could be put in place? Well, one possibility is cost review. If there is an ongoing review of all the costs in the business to make sure that any unnecessary costs are taken out, or, where possible, that any fixed costs are converted into variable costs, that will help protect them against the risk of a downturn. And what about output controls? What measurement could they use that would help? Well, really, this is going to be about reviewing financial data, making sure that the financial data is very closely watched, and that if costs start to move up or revenue starts to move down, they know about it. What about the risk that oil prices rise and cause an increase in their cost base? Is there an input control that would be relevant here? Well, the risk of a rise in oil price is a classic financial risk, and we'll look at this in a bit more detail later on. But an input control that could be effective here is to recruit a treasury function. And a treasury function are specialists in managing financial risk, and they will be able to deal with this for you. They would also handle the foreign exchange risk that, remember, we felt would probably be an issue for British Airways too. Is there a process control? Well, you can put in place a policy about hedging your exposure to oil price rises. In the short term, it is possible to buy your oil in advance at a fixed price, and that protects you from price increases. So having a policy that says, for example, you have bought all your oil 12 months in advance will protect you from increases during that 12 months. And is there an output measure? Well, there are various ways of monitoring your exposure to oil price rises, or indeed other forms of financial risk. And later on we'll look at something called value at risk, which is a very common way of doing this. What about the risk of industrial action? Well, one possible input control would be to ensure fair treatment of staff, which hopefully will make them less likely to go on strike. There are various procedures you could put in place to try and reduce the risk of industrial action. In particular, you might want to have staff consultation processes in place before any changes are implemented, and have a grievance process so that staff who feel they have an issue know who they can discuss it with and know it's going to be dealt with. There are various measures that might help you here. You might want to monitor measures of staff engagement. So how engaged, how happy are your staff working for you? That can be measured using tools like the employee survey or possibly absence rates. In terms of the weather, can you do anything about that? Well, we talked about this would be a candidate where you'd probably want to transfer some of the risk and maybe buy some insurance, but there are controls you could use as well. In terms of input controls, you could ensure that you had staff training so that all staff knew, insofar as possible, how to deal with bad weather. So that you can at least minimize the disruption. Everyone knows what they need to do. Are there procedures you could put in place? Well, you could put in place backup procedures, so that if normal operations can't go ahead, if things can't run as normal, then there's a fallback, there's another way things can run, if that's at all practical. Are there measurements? Well, yes, you might want to measure the number of flights cancelled, for example. And if flights cancelled go above a certain target level, then maybe you need to revisit your bad weather preparations and perhaps try and improve your preparedness. What about climate change reducing demand? Now, this is a really tricky one. It's a long-term strategic risk to the business. There are some input controls you could put in place. You might want to try and hire some advisors or some experts in how to deal with climate change. For example, people who can help you design engines that are more environmentally friendly, they generate less carbon. Or perhaps how you have a carbon offset program to ensure that you're putting back any carbon that you're putting into the atmosphere. In terms of procedures, you might want to bring in some sort of carbon offset program, so that all the flights you carry out are offset by planting trees or something like that, so that you can demonstrate you are doing your bit to resist climate change. Are there measures that would help you here? Well, possibly public surveys, showing the level of public concern about climate change and whether that is likely to result in them flying less. That is something you could monitor. And then finally, the safety risk, the risk that someone is hurt during the course of a flight. Well, there are numerous controls you might want to put in place here. In terms of the input side, you would definitely want to have staff training, to ensure that all staff are trained on safety awareness, they know what to do if there's an emergency, they are very safety conscious and never take risks with it. Are there procedures you'd want to put in place? Well, there are lots. You will want to do, for example, aircraft checks. So every time before it flies, someone needs to check that everything is working properly and there's nothing dangerous. You have announcements at the start of each flight so that all passengers are aware of the safety procedure. That again will reduce the risk. And then in terms of output measures, are there measures you would want to compile here? Yes, you would want to measure certainly any safety incidents, so any incidents where someone is hurt, as well as what are referred to as near misses, situations where someone could have been hurt and perhaps it was just a matter of luck that they weren't. If the level of incidents or near misses starts to creep up, then you may need to revisit this area and tighten up your procedures or take other action to reduce the risk. Okay, let's recap this chapter. The first section dealt with one of the key pieces of knowledge you will need for this paper. You need to be able to identify and analyze controls for an organization that will deal with specific risks. There are three ways you can think about this. You can think about input controls, which generally means controls to do with HR or people. You can think about controls relating to process, so you can put a procedure of some sort in place, and if everyone follows the procedure, you will reduce risk. And you can think about controls relating to output, which basically means putting a measurement in place. There are these three approaches to controls for any risk you can think of. So that's really valuable to be aware of when you're coming to answer exam questions. We looked a little bit at control systems, and you need to understand the difference between single loop control systems, where the standard that is being used to judge the output is static, and then a double loop control system actually allows for changes to the standard. And you may well think of this in terms of a budget. Is there scope to change the budget, i.e. the standard that we're comparing our performance to? Just quickly looked at the terms feedback, which is information about what has happened in the past, and feed forward, which uses information for what will happen in the future, both of which can be used to control systems and ensure things are kept on track. Notice one of the differences between these two is that because feedback is fundamentally backward-looking, it can only take corrective action to deal with errors that have already happened. Feed forward can actually prevent errors because it's forward-looking. And then in section 3, we raise the point that you need to recommend controls that are appropriate to the organisation and to the systems that you are given to analyse. Don't just trot out a standard list of controls. You need to tailor them to the information you've been given. And you may find the mnemonic secret useful in terms of looking for clues in the scenario that may help you decide what controls to recommend.